Hello and welcome to Daily News Simplified. Here we have taken the important articles and the news clippings that has featured in the daily edition of the Hindu newspaper. The articles and the topics for the discussion are listed on your screen. Moving on to the first article of the day that has appeared on page 8 of the Hindu, basically talks about the global south. Now the global south is in news because of the unwillingness of many leading countries in Africa, Asia and Latin America to stand with NATO over the war in Ukraine. Now through this article we will first try to understand what basically is global south. Secondly, we'll try to understand what is the importance for the South-South cooperation between the countries of Global South. What are the issues in the South-South cooperation between the countries? So, beginning our discussion with the Global South, the term Global South emerged for the first time in 1969 and was used for the first time by the political activist RAU'S. Further, there has been a division during the Cold War era between the First World countries, the Second World countries, and the Third World countries. Before that, there was not a global south that was collectively termed as. First World countries were recognized as the countries which were advanced and followed capitalism as the model of development. Second World countries were regarded as the socialist nations, and the Third World countries were regarded as developing nations that may still be under the colonial yoke. It is to be understood about Global South today that Global South is not geographical. In fact, the two of the largest countries, that is India and China, part of Global South, lie entirely in the northern hemisphere. The common feature between the Global South countries is that most of the countries under the Global South grouping were at the receiving end of imperialism and the colonial rule. In the recent time, the article further explains the economic might of the countries in the Global South has increased, and it is estimated that by 2030, 3 of the 4 largest economies will be from the Global South. Today also, already in the terms of GDP, on the basis of purchasing power, Global South dominated BRICS grouping has surpassed the Global North G7 club. And this economic shift or rise of economic might of the Global South has gone hand in hand with the enhanced political visibility. Today, the countries of the Global South are increasingly asserting themselves. It can be seen with the diplomatic rise of China brokering a deal between Iran and Saudi Arabia, Brazil's attempt to push for a peace plan as an end for the war in Ukraine. And this has been regarded, this economic shift and the rise in political power has been regarded by the political scientists as the coming of Asian century or today as the coming of post-Western world. Now that we have discussed what basically Global South is, we'll discuss what is the importance of Global South. The first importance of Global South or the South-South cooperation is that it will drive or it is driving the economic growth. Today, Global South is seen as a major contributor to more than world's economic growth, and in the recent year there is a collaboration which fuels the economic progress. Secondly, there has been an increasing trade in the Global South. The intra-South trade or the trade between the Global South countries has reached to an unprecedented level. And the increasing intra-South trade is important because it strengthens the regional economies, improves the market access, and promotes the economic integration. So this is the second importance of increasing South-South cooperation or Global South. Another importance of the Global South is the foreign direct investment from this region. Now, the outflow of FDI or the foreign direct investment from the Global South today represents a significant amount of the global flow. And this foreign direct investment from the Global South economies promotes infrastructural development, creation of jobs, and also promotes technological advancement. And most prominent example of this increased foreign direct investment today can be seen with the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative, which creates massive infrastructure, boosts jobs, and introduces technology to the areas. The next thing that the Global South will serve is the poverty alleviation, as the collaboration between the Global South And the integration of global south with that of north has increased the flow of remittances that has helped the low and middle income countries and played a crucial role in moving millions of families out of poverty. Basically, they have contributed in the significant reduction of poverty worldwide. And at last, the Global South cooperation is important to achieve Sustainable Development Goals or the SDG. The 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development Goals necessitates the ideas, energy, and the countries in the Global South to work collectively. And it is through this collective participation of countries in the Global South the SDG agenda of 2030 can be realized. However, despite of having such importance among the Global South, or despite of having such importance for the South-South cooperation, there are still various issues in the Global South or ensuring the South-South cooperation. The first issue is regard with the power imbalance and the exploitation that is happening. It has been seen that the stronger countries in the Global South sometimes take advantage of the weak partners that they implement their project in. Thus, it undermines the principles of fairness and also that of equitable distribution. And the country that has been prominent in that is China. The second issue that the South-South cooperation or the Global South coordination faces is the environmental concerns and the public health are not given due regard. As it has been seen that certain oil companies that are working in the Global South countries have complete disregard for the environmental impact and the public health, and thus ensures an unsustainable way of exploration. The third problem that the South-South cooperation faces is the misuse of the financial assistance by the Global South countries. Now the countries exploit the financial assistance by undertaking diversion of financial assistance that were intended for social impact projects for the other purposes. This undermines the overall trust and hamper genuine developmental effort in the region. Next problem that the Global South countries face is the principle or the strong adherence to the non-interference principle. The strong adherence to the non-interference principle has caused the local conflict that are present in the countries to sustain, particularly with regard to the developmental efforts led by China and that of India, who prioritize economic profits or economic intervention over conflict resolution. The next major challenge that the South-South cooperation or the Global South grouping as a whole faces is that there is a lack of institutional and financial capacity with this grouping. Now, Global South is not a coherent group. Further, the Global South has no shared agenda, and the collective institutions that were made for the purpose, like that of NAM, that is non-aligned movement, and new international economic order, have remained dysfunctional, and this has led to strong regional competition and opposition even among the countries of the Global South. So, lack of any coherent grouping, common agenda, and the collective institutions have contributed Global South development to stop. There is also a lack of financial capacity among the countries of the Global South to fund the projects in other countries. And the last challenge that the Global South or the South-South cooperation face is the North-dominated mindset. The North-oriented mindset and the traditional vertical link with the metropoles of the world and world being still dominated by the United States and the collective West further hampers the cooperation between the Global South. So, with that, we have seen what are the issues in the South-South cooperation or Global South, wherein there have been a regional power imbalance between the grouping, wherein the principles of fairness and equitable distribution are undermined, environmental concerns are not given due regard for, there is a misuse and diversion of financial assistance which causes trust and development efforts to decline, the principle of economic profit gaining legitimacy over conflict resolution, and the non-interference principle has caused the local conflict in the Global South countries to sustain. There is lack of institutional setups with institutions like NAM and new international economic order remaining dysfunctional apart from the financial capacity limitations that the group faces. And the global south countries are still dominated by a north oriented mindset and the traditional vertical links which it has with the metropoles. We have also seen with this the importance of South-South cooperation in the very beginning and what basically Global South is, what was the first, second and the third world, and how the rise of Global South is seen as a rise of Asian centuries and post-Western world. Now we know that India is the voice of Global South. But India also faces certain limitations. Now, through a question, we'll try to understand what are the issues that may limit India's ability to emerge as the champion of the Global South. Now, we have taken a question in this regard. In regard with the Global South, the question here says the need to address the common challenges with the developing world promoted India to voice the issues of Global South. In this context, highlight the potential challenges that may limit India's ability to emerge as a champion of Global South. In the upcoming mains examination, a question on Global South can thus be asked, so we have framed a question in this manner. Now, while writing the answer in our introduction, we will write about how India has long been a champion of the developing world. In the past, India pursued the leadership of developing world in the form of non-aligned movement, that is NAM, and pursuing new international economic order. We can also highlight that even in contemporary world, India and developing world today faces common problems or the common challenges, that is inadequate representation in global bodies, vulnerable to climate change, disruption in supply of critical raw materials, terrorism, etc. In the body part of our answer, we'll write about the challenges that India will face in emerging as a champion of Global South. The first challenge is competition from China, as China sees itself as a champion of developing world. Further, China has emerged as a key developmental partner, provider of infrastructure, which is sponsored by the deep pockets and has also provided the alternate development model for the developing countries. The second challenge that India will face is the neo-colonialism of China. Now, Chinese Belt and Road Initiative and its model of establishing special economic zone in the region has turned out to be a neo-colonial attempt by the China, and it has also not subscribed to the principles of South-South cooperation. So Chinese model of BRI, establishment of SEZ, reflects its neo-colonial understanding, and China further does not subscribe to the South-South cooperation and has compromised on the sovereign boundaries of the countries. The next challenge that India will face in order to emerge as a champion of Global South is its growing closeness with the United States and the developed world, as today Indian foreign policy is tilted in the favor of United States, which is also reflected by its closeness to the Western world through Quad or by joining the IPEF framework, which reflects the common security consensus between India and the Western world. The next challenge that India will face is the big brother attitude that has been limited on India even in its neighborhood. Even the neighboring countries like Nepal, Pakistan use India through suspicion, and India has thus failed to forge a leadership and solidarity even in its own backyard. So the big brother attitude of India will come in the way of championing the cause of Global South. The next challenge that India will face in emerging as a champion is the pursuit of regional and bilateral agenda. Now, there is a lack of movement for reform in the global multilateral institutions, which has resulted that India is now looking for regional partnership by its membership into BIMSTEC or through SCO and through the bilateral partnership with signing of trade agreement with individual countries. So the pursuit of regional and bilateral agenda by India in the lieu of failure of multilateral institution will come in the way for India to voice the concern of the global south at global level. The next issue that India will face is the anti-Western orientation of the third world solidarity. Now, India will face problem in spearheading global south because the USA and the other Western countries think that the global south solidarity is nothing but as a fallback to the era of non-alignment, and thus the third world solidarity is seen having an anti-Western orientation. And the last issue that India will face to emerge as a true leader of global south is the conflict on the climate issue. Now there is a conflict on the climate issue because India itself is one of the largest emitter, and climate change will affect most of the least developed countries, small island developing countries, etc., which have demanded to put a limit on global warming. Thus, India's continued emission will go against solidarity with the developing world on the climate issue. At the last, we will conclude our answer by saying that India should keep the above challenges in mind and should be a bridge between developing and the developed world, and should forge a fine balance between global interest and the national interest. So with this, we have seen how to answer question on global south, where we will start with the India's leadership, list the point which reflect how India's leadership of global south will be challenged, and at the end we will conclude the need to balance national interest and to align them with the global interest as the need of the hour for India. Moving on to the next article of the day, the article has featured on page 6 of the Hindu and basically talks about the second moonshot, or that is Chandrayaan 3 mission. Now this article is important from the perspective of General Studies paper 3 and particularly with regard to the prelims examination, as it talks about awareness in the field of IT, space, computer, robotics, nanotechnology, biotechnology and the issues relating to IPR. Now, the article mentions that the Indian Space Research Organization plans to launch the Chandrayaan 3 mission, that is India's third lunar mission, to the moon on July 14. We'll again have a discussion regarding Chandrayaan 3 after the launch. In this discussion, we'll just focus on the basics of this mission. Now, Chandrayaan 3 mission is basically a follow-on mission to Chandrayaan 2, and this is to demonstrate an end-to-end capability in safe landing and roving on the lunar surface. Now, the launch will take on board a launch vehicle Mark III from Sriharikota in Andhra Pradesh. It is to be duly noted that the duration of the mission is only meant for half lunar day, that translates to the 14 Earth days. Now, this mission will be India's second attempt to soft land a lander and a rover on the lunar surface. Prior to this, Chandrayaan 2 was launched in 2019 in the form of an orbiter and a lander. While the orbiter entered into the orbit around the moon, the surface mission in 2019 under Chandrayaan 2 failed when the lander crashed instead of executing a slow descent. Now, Chandrayaan 3 consists of a lander and a rover which is similar to Chandrayaan 2 but would not have an orbiter. Now, for the mission, Moon's South Pole has been chosen. Moon's South Pole has been chosen because of the possibility of the presence of water. It has been assessed by the experts that there is a possibility of presence of water at the south. Water ice has been detected at both the poles of Moon. But the South Pole has more area in the permanent shadow and also have colder temperature, so it is thought to have more water ice. The second reason that Moon's South Pole has been chosen is that South Pole witnesses extremely cold temperature. The South Pole witnesses extremely cold temperature, which means that anything that is trapped here would remain frozen in time without undergoing much change. So the element of change is limited. The rocks and the soil in this region thus could provide a clue for early solar system. And at the last, the South Pole is chosen because it is located in the Aitken Basin. Aitken Basin basically is a huge crater, and there may be material from the deep crust and upper mantle of the moon near the surface. So with this, we have seen that Chandrayaan 3 is a follow-on mission for Chandrayaan 2. Chandrayaan 2 mission, which was launched in 2019 but failed to ensure the proper execution of the rover. The duration of the mission will be for the half lunar day, that is equivalent to 14 Earth days. And for the mission, South Pole has been chosen because of the possibility of presence of water, the clue for the early solar system, and also due to the location of Aitken Basin, which can provide for the material from deep crust and mantle. We'll again have a follow-up on the Chandrayaan 3 mission in the latest session of our DNS. Moving on to the next article of the day, the article has appeared on page 13 of the Hindu and basically talks about Solomon Islands and China's deal on police, economy and technology collaboration. Now this article is important from the perspective of General Studies paper 2, which talks about the bilateral, regional and global groupings and the agreements involving India or affecting India's interest. It also talks about effect of policies and the politics of developed and developing countries on the Indian interest. Now, the leaders of Solomon Islands and China has promised to expand their relations. It is to be remembered that Solomon Island is located approximately 2000 kilometers northeast of Australia. And Solomon Island is regarded as the biggest success in a campaign of China to expand its presence in the South Pacific region. As in 2019, it was Solomon Islands which have switched the official recognition to Beijing from Taiwan, and also in 2022, Solomon Islands signed a security pact which sparked the international concern over the possibility of Beijing or China building its first military base in the region. Now this region is particularly important. This region is located between US, China and Australia. And this region holds strategic importance for security as well as defense. The US has long maintained its influence and military presence in the Pacific region, while recently China has focused on strengthening its ties in the Pacific through increased aid development, diplomacy and security cooperation. We'll try to understand what basically is happening in the South Pacific. Now, in the South Pacific, China has signed off a variety of smaller bilateral agreements during the past decade. This area is important, as we have seen, for both United States and its allies like Australia. And as India is now getting more aligned with the United States, it affects the Indian concern also, especially with regard to the connectivity and linking of the Indo-Pacific region. So the interest of India gets also aligned in this. We'll try to understand what has basically happened in this area with these diplomatic moves from China. Now the first thing that has happened in this area is the isolation of Taiwan. Now, international strategists are of the opinion that China wants to use these island countries to further diplomatically isolate Taiwan, as several of the island countries like Marshall Islands, Nauru, Palau, Tuvalu recognize Taiwan as a sovereign country. It is seen that Chinese outreach and development efforts in this region could therefore help it to reduce regional support by these countries to Taiwan. So basically to isolate Taiwan. And this was even highlighted in the recent times by the support given by Honiara, which has recently cut its ties with Taiwan. So the Chinese foreign policy has started generating results in this region, basically to isolate Taiwan and its cause of independence. This region is also important as China is successful in isolation of Australia in the recent time, as China wants to develop its overseas military bases in the region, and this could lead Australia, which is an important ally for United States, to be isolated. Further, in the recent time, there is also an emergence of zero-sum game in the Pacific. Now, this zero-sum game has emerged wherein China's engagement is all about increasing its influence in the region and also to diminish the Australian and the American influence in the region. So this appears to be a zero-sum game, as earlier Australia was the only country having a security cooperation agreement with Honiara, but now it has signed an agreement with China also. Thus, Australia went from being a key security provider to be one of the security provider. Further, scholars believe that there is a generation of great game now in Pacific. Apart from the zero sum game, there is a generation of great game in the Pacific. This great game is generated by increased US interest in the region. Now US, through its Indo-Pacific strategy, outlines that it is keen to focus on every corner of the region, including the Pacific Islands, which has been a cause of worry for China. US has also formed Quad for this region, which China sees as an Asian NATO, and thus China is also taking its steps to realign its relationship with the Pacific Island countries. Thus, a new great game has emerged in the Pacific region. Apart from the strategic reason, this region is also important from the perspective of economics. The Pacific region is an important trade route and also has a lot of abundant natural resources which can be utilized. So it is important for countries like Australia, New Zealand, etc. to secure sea lines of communication. And at the last, the recent competition between United States and China to increase their influence has overlooked on the climate hazard that these countries face. Now, many Pacific Island nations are worried of the impact of climate change and the rising sea level, which pose an immediate existential threat to these countries. However, very less regard is given to the climate change in these countries, despite of the repeated requests of the leaders of these countries, which consider that the region is not threatened by a conflict between China and US, but by the geopolitical effects of climate change. So these are the developments that have happened in the South Pacific region, and India being an important ally in the Indo-Pacific strategy of US and also its membership to organizations like Quad gets involved in the development of these regions. At last, it can be concluded that the two geopolitical superpowers have started to compete in this region, and the small countries or the small island nations are just used as a pawns in broader global ambition. The emergence of zero-sum game and the great game in Pacific, along with their economical importance and the diplomatic isolations with subdued geopolitical interests, reflect the realities of this area. Moving on to the next article of the day, the article is featured on page 11 of the Hindu and basically talks about China's protest regarding the meeting between the US official and Dalai Lama in Delhi and calling it as an interference. Now, China has protested against the meeting of Dalai Lama and the officials of the CTA with the visiting US official, Uzra Zaya, in New Delhi, and calls it an effort to interfere in the China's internal affairs. Now, for China, Tibet, also known as Xinjiang, is a purely internal affair and no external forces have the right to interfere in it. China further firmly opposes any form of contact between the foreign officials and the Tibetan independence forces. The article further explains that the China has explained that US should take concrete steps to honor its commitment of acknowledging Xinjiang, that is Tibet, as a part of China, stop meddling in the internal affairs of China, and offer no support to anti-China separatist activities of the Dalai clique. And they referred CTA, that is the Central Tibetan Administration, as a separatist political group which is not recognized by any country. Now, this article is important from the general studies 2 perspective. In our previous discussion of DNS, we have understood what basically is the boundary dispute in the western, middle and the eastern sector between India and China. Through this article, we'll try to understand what is the Tibet issue between India and China, what has been the history of Tibet, and what are the recent developments in Tibet that China has made to further its claim over Tibet. Now, the history of Tibet can be tracked back to the year of 1914. Tibet was India's actual neighbor, and in 1914 it was the Tibetan representatives along with the Chinese that have signed the Simla Convention with the British India. And this convention has delineated the boundaries between the two countries. It is to be remembered that most of the Indian boundaries is with the Tibetan Autonomous Region and not the rest of the China. So Tibet was actually having the boundary, and Tibet was the actual neighbor of India in 1914. Then, to improve and better the Indian-Chinese relationship, India had voluntarily revoked its special rights with regard to Tibet. These rights were inherited by India from the British Raj. But for the sake of better India-China relationship and the acceptance of Chinese rule in Tibet has reduced the India's ability to play any meaningful role in Tibet. After the Chinese accession in 1950, what has happened that China repudiated the convention, and in 1954 the two countries, that is India and China, signed an agreement through which the two countries and basically India accepted Tibet as the Tibet region of China. So it was a 1954 agreement that formally accepted Tibet as the Tibet region of China. We have seen in 1914 convention, Tibet was an actual neighbor of India, but by the 1954 agreement, Tibet was accepted as a Tibet region of China. But things changed after that. In 1959, Dalai Lama fled to India. Dalai Lama fled to India and was provided support from Prime Minister Nehru, who gave Dalai Lama as well as the Tibetan refugees the necessary shelter that they needed. And this refugee population also even established a Tibetan government in exile, and which continues to hold election till date. Now, the India's acceptance of Tibet as a part of China has changed the geostrategic and the geopolitical environment in the region. Because with the disappearance of Tibet as a buffer state between India and China, China and India now stood eye to eye over an undemarcated Himalayan border. It was believed by Nehru that by sacrificing Tibet for the sake of friendship between India and China, the relationship between the two countries could have blossomed. But on the other hand, China claimed that the boundary between British India and Tibet was the work of European imperialists and the Tibetan feudal lords, and thus the boundary treaties need to be renegotiated. So, India lost the strategic buffer in the form of Tibet when it accepted in 1954 Tibet as a part of China. Now, from then, Tibet has been a source of friction between the two countries. The presence of Dalai Lama and his followers in India is a source of friction between the two countries. China has claimed that Dalai Lama is using his position and his refuge in India to lobby for the independence of Tibet and is thus trying to break up China. And this has been termed by Chinese as the activity which will cause ultimately the splitting of the motherland. And China has asked Indian government to take steps regarding the issue. So at last, the tension between India and China regarding Tibet is that the Tibetan question still exists. China feels that the India keeps the Tibetan question alive by giving refuge to Dalai Lama, and this has caused the relationship between the two countries to not improve. So, the importance of Tibet can be regarded by the fact that the heart of India-China rivalry is the dominance in Asia. And at the heart of this rivalry lies the Tibet. The Chinese occupation of Tibet has changed the asymmetry between the two sides, as China was now able to exercise its geostrategic influence over much of the South Asia. And the loss of Tibet as a buffer zone crippled the security of the northern frontiers of India. Further, to justify their claims over Tibet, China in the recent time have taken certain steps. There have been a lot of recent developments that have happened in Tibet. Now, there have been changes in the Tibet itself. This change have been brought by the efforts of Chinese government. Chinese government have gone for investment and also have been pouring the Han or the mainland Chinese population in this region. Further, apart from the massive investment and the pouring of mainland Chinese population, Chinese government has been successful in suppressing the links of Tibetan population to Dalai Lama. So the internal politics of Tibet has changed over the years. As the investment of China is pouring in the region, there has been massive infrastructural drive that has been committed by China. And this massive infrastructural drive can be seen by the establishment of Tibetan villages along the LAC and also massive dam construction over the upper riparian stretch of Brahmaputra. This is also a cause of concern as this can emerge as the new flashpoint between India and China. The China has also changed its security approach vis-a-vis Tibet. What the Chinese government has now done is that they have raised a Tibetan militia group as a counter to Tibetan Special Frontier Force which is trained by the Indian Army. And this can also emerge as a flashpoint or a cause of contention between India and China. Further, the Chinese claims are more strengthened by the policies of Indian government. There is a question over the future of the Tibetan community in India because the Indian government does not give citizenship to the Tibetans who are born in India after 1987 and thus leaving the youth of the community in limbo, and these youth have no connection of what is happening back home in Tibet. Now in the recent time there have been change in policy of United States also with regard to Tibet. United States has in the recent time increased its role in Tibet. It is now home to more than 30,000 Tibetan refugees and also Karmapa Lama, the head of Karma Kagyu sect, permanently resides in the United States. And this meeting between the Central Tibetan Administration, Dalai Lama, and the US official further highlights United States' increased involvement in the Tibetan cause so as to restrict China at a regional level and realize their larger political goals regarding the Indo-Pacific region. The last development in Tibet can be seen with regard to the succession of Dalai Lama. The larger question is the succession of Dalai Lama, who is not only considered as a spiritual leader but also a political leader of the community. And China has made it clear that it intends to announce its own Dalai Lama, wherein the US is also likely to weigh in by settling Karmapa Lama in its territory. So these have been the recent developments in Tibet that can further cause a bone of contention between India and China. Through this article, we have tried to understand what has been the history of Tibet, how the 1914 agreement changed during the 1954 to maintain friendly relationship between India and China, how the 1954 acceptance of Tibet as a part of China altered the geostrategic and the geopolitical environment in the South Asian region, and the Tibetan question where India providing refuge to the Dalai Lama is seen as a cause of friction between India and China today also. We have also seen what have been the recent developments, how Chinese government have reasserted their claim over Tibet by investment and by population transfer. We've also seen the renewed focus of United States in the Tibetan region as a larger part of its Indo-Pacific policy that involves restricting China in the region and not to challenge its hegemony. At the last, it is to be understood that the official Indian policy today is that Dalai Lama is a spiritual leader and the population of Tibetan people in exile are not allowed to undertake any political activity in India. However, a renewed focus towards the Tibetan cause, both by the global powers like United States and also by referring from India, has been a cause of contention between India and China apart from the other issues related to boundary